Opening the center for piece development, this pawn push immediately stakes a claim and begins the battle for central control. Developing the knight towards the center immediately creates dynamic possibilities and prepares for pawn breaks, offering flexible options across the board. Developing the knight immediately asserts central influence, preparing for pawn pushes and adding pressure to black's developing pieces. Establishing central influence immediately, black challenges white's pawn and opens lines for immediate counterplay. Unleashing the bishop early aims to control key diagonals, potentially cramping black's development and securing a slight spatial edge. Solidifying the center, this pawn advances to control important squares and prepare for further development, though it slightly restricts the bishop. Ambushing the c7 pawn, this move boldly seizes initiative, creating immediate tactical worries for black. Dodging the knight's threat, the sidestepping cavalry establishes a flexible defensive presence on the queen side. Solidifying the center, preparing for c4, and opening lines for the queen and potentially the other bishop, while avoiding immediate pawn weaknesses. Developing the bishop here solidifies the pawn structure and prepares to castle, aligning forces for the middle game without creating immediate weaknesses. Safeguarding the central pawn and preparing for castling, this knight subtly fortifies the kingside while maintaining flexibility for future pawn advancements. Anchoring the king behind a secure pawn shield, this maneuver prepares to swiftly redeploy pieces for action and unlocks the rook's potential access to the central files, a crucial step in developing active counterplay against white's aggressive early knight sortie. Challenging black's queenside structure, this pawn thrust immediately seeks to gain space and potentially weaken the pawn chain, creating attacking avenues. Challenging white's aggressive pawn push immediately forces a difficult decision, preventing an easy expansion on the queenside and creating counterplay by exploiting the undefended pawn on b2. Recentralizing the knight after black's solidifying pawn structure, this repositions the piece for potential kingside pressure or a swift transition to a more active square, keeping black guessing about white's immediate attacking intentions. Unleashing a pawn thrust to shatter white's central ambition and reclaim space, black initiates a dynamic confrontation, seeking to destabilize the opponent's knight outpost and open avenues for counterplay. Initiating a pawn storm with this aggressive advance aims to fracture black's queenside pawn structure and potentially open lines towards the castled king. The knight on a6 is now a bit misplaced, and white seeks to exploit this by creating threats on the kingside and controlling more space. Boldly challenging the kingside pawn thrust, this maneuver immediately disrupts white's attacking intentions and aims to control the crucial central squares. By centralizing the knight, black seeks to untangle its pieces and prepare for a counterstrike, potentially exploiting any overextended white pawns. It's a dynamic decision, prioritizing activity over passive defense. Disrupting black's central pawn structure, this knight exchange immediately opens lines and creates dynamic imbalances. White's intention appears to be exploiting the weakened dark squares around black's king, forcing a sharp recalculation of defensive resources. The captured knight was a key defender, and its removal might leave black's kingside exposed to further pressure. Embracing the open center, black recaptures the pawn, forging a dynamic pawn chain and liberating the queen's bishop to influence the queenside while creating potential attacking avenues on the c-file. Emboldened by the central pawn structure, the knight makes a bold leap forward, challenging black's queen and seeking a dominant outpost on the 5th rank. Unleashing the pawn center's potential, this capture liberates black's central pawns and initiates a dynamic confrontation, aiming to disrupt white's knight outpost and pry open the position for piece activity. Unlocking the central dark squares with this pawn recapture opens up immediate attacking avenues for your pieces, potentially creating a dominant bishop pair and challenging black's pawn structure. Initiating a dynamic pawn thrust on the queenside, black redirects their knight to a potentially disruptive square, aiming to exploit the momentarily exposed c2 pawn and harass white's developing pieces. Unleashing the bishop to c4 sharpens the diagonal assault, directly menacing the pawn on f7 and probing for weaknesses in black's nascent kingside structure, while simultaneously preparing to contest control of the important central squares. Seizing the pawn on d4 initiates a bold tactical sequence, but be acutely aware of the exposed position of the queen, now a tempting target, potentially creating unforeseen counterplay for your opponent. A bold repositioning, this thrust of the c-pawn simultaneously strengthens white's pawn chain while creating an escape square for the queen, subtly increasing the pressure along the queenside files. The queen exchange is initiated, leading to a potential endgame where white's knight on e5 will be a prominent feature, potentially exploiting weaknesses on the dark squares of black's queenside if not carefully managed. The rook now claims the open d-file, a crucial artery for central influence and potential pawn breakthroughs. This reshapes the battlefield towards a more strategic endgame where piece activity and pawn structure will dictate success. The knight's relocation to d5 initiates a fascinating positional dance, seeking to exploit the now unprotected dark squares around the white king, particularly after the queen exchange. It's a move that embraces the inherent complexities of this slightly unusual pawn structure, where black's c-pawn stands advanced, creating a potential weakness but also a launchpad for pieces. The placement of the knight here is crucial. It eyes the c3 and e3 pawns, forcing white to remain vigilant and preventing immediate kingside pawn pushes. Think of it as a strategic anchor, a piece that's both a defender of black's kingside and an attacker on white's central pawn chain, all while maintaining flexibility for future maneuver. The bishop's retreat to g3 aims to protect the crucial e5 square, preventing black's knight from finding a more imposing outpost and simultaneously reinforcing white's central pawn structure, setting the stage for a positional battle where controlling key squares becomes paramount. Reclaiming the central files with the rook on d8 is a shrewd decision, bringing one of black's most powerful pieces back into the fray and directly contesting the d-file that white has so assiduously occupied. This assertive repositioning not only prevents white's bishop on g3 from developing further offensive pressure on the kingside, but also prepares for potential infiltration into white's camp should the opportunity arise. The rook's presence here hints at a desire to simplify the position, or at least ensure that any material imbalances are thoroughly evaluated on open lines. Pondering the potential for a devastating discovered attack on the d-file, white repositions the bishop, eyeing the undefended rook and creating a subtle trap by potentially luring black's knight to an exposed square on the queenside. Initiating this pawn push, f6, attempts to break open the central tension and potentially dislodge white's active bishop on g3. However, it simultaneously creates a potential weakness on the e6 square, which could become a target for white's pieces if not carefully defended. This move also opens the f-file, which might eventually be useful for black's rook, but for now, it demands immediate attention to the dynamic balance. A daring repositioning, the knight retreats to a less exposed square, aiming to bolster the queenside and potentially join an attack on the d-file. Consolidating the bishop's influence on the queenside now offers black the ability to develop a cohesive pawn structure, potentially hindering white's knight from finding a comfortable outpost and preparing for a controlled expansion. Asserting dominance over the d-file, the rook now eyes potential infiltration points and supports its knight's outpost, aiming to disrupt black's passive development and create immediate threats along the open column. Black asserts spatial equality on the queenside by challenging the advanced bishop and opening lines for the rook, a proactive maneuver aiming to disrupt white's development and create counterplay before white can solidify their central grip. Securing the bishop on b3 offers white a more robust outpost and prepares to contest the open c-file, potentially leading to a more favorable exchange scenario down the line. The knight's journey to f4 aims to disrupt white's pawn structure and potentially exchange off white's most active bishop, offering black much-needed breathing room and simplifying the position towards an endgame where black might have better prospects due to white's isolated d-pawn and less active king. A daring repositioning of the bishop, aiming to create immediate pressure on black's queenside structure and perhaps prepare a swift kingside attack with the newly unleashed pawns. A sudden royal intrusion forces a critical decision, as the knight, having infiltrated enemy territory, now directly challenges the king's immediate safety and disrupts white's developing harmony. This tactical geometry highlights the knight's newfound influence, threatening both the rook and the pawn on e4, while simultaneously exploiting the somewhat exposed position of white's king, now that its usual pawn shield has been somewhat dismantled by the aggressive pawn pushes. The immediate pressure compels white to address the check, potentially leading to an exchange that could simplify the position or, if handled poorly, create further weaknesses. The monarch, forced from its sanctuary, now navigates a perilous central corridor. The open file's a constant threat, while the immediate tactical exchange is avoided, prioritizing king's safety above all else in this delicate repositioning. Black's knight now finds a commanding outpost on c5, eyeing the light squares and preparing to potentially harass the white king's defenses. Initiating a complex maneuver to reclaim lost pawn structure and potentially exploit the d-file's open potential, this knight relocation aims to reposition for future central control or to contest the now exposed d-pawn. Navigating a landscape where black's rook controls an open file and the knight on c5 is a formidable outpost, white's response is a calculated risk, trading positional advantages for tactical opportunities. This knight's journey toward the queenside suggests a desire to influence the pawn structure there or to reinforce the queenside defense, a subtle but significant shift in strategic focus. By vacating the center, white may be preparing for a more aggressive pawn push or seeking to avoid tactical lines that could lead to material loss in the current congested position. Considering the compromised kingside defenses of both monarchs, this knight's repositioning can be seen as a defensive precaution, a silent guardian against potential immediate threats. Capturing the knight frees up the bishop on d7 to eye the d-file, potentially setting up pressure against the rook, while also simplifying into a structure where black's knight on c5 is well placed to control key central squares. By capturing the knight, white boldly accepts a doubled pawn on the queenside, a choice that drastically reshapes the pawn structure. This strategic decision opens the file for immediate pressure, while simultaneously sacrificing pawn flexibility for piece activity. The resulting position demands careful maneuvering from both sides. Black must address the open file before white can fully exploit it, and white needs to find a way to neutralize the potential weaknesses inherent in their fractured pawn chain. The pawn on a3 now stands as a potential outpost for a black piece, a target that requires constant vigilance, making the fight for control of the central and queenside squares exceptionally sharp. Securing the bishop to a more active diagonal, this piece now eyes weaknesses on the queenside and potentially supports a future pawn advance. Opening the d-file forces the opponent's rook away, simplifying the position and creating a clear path for your remaining rook to become active. This exchange aims to establish dominance on the open file and potentially exploit any weaknesses that arise in the ensuing simplified middle game. The rook assumes its newly opened dominion, preparing to reassert influence over the crucial central files, a vital step as the game simplifies towards a potentially decisive endgame. The king's shelter is compromised, as the pawn thrust aggressively opens a dangerous diagonal for the opponent's bishop. An attempt to build a defensive bulwark against the encroaching white pawn, but it simultaneously creates a structural weakness on the kingside, potentially exposing the king to future attacks. Instantly seize control of the open file, leveraging the rook's power to pressure black's isolated pawn and potentially create diversions that distract from the defense of the vulnerable king. Rescuing the bishop from its predicament, black maneuvers it to a square where it eyes the pawn chain and can potentially support advances on the queenside, while also anticipating white's likely attempt to consolidate their passed pawn. Opening the kingside further with this knight's sortie is a gamble, pushing it into a potentially hostile territory where it might become a target. Consider the exposed nature of your monarch in the ensuing exchanges. Preparing to launch the king into the fray, aiming to exploit the open files and activate its dormant power. The bishop relocates to create a formidable attacking spearhead, eyeing the weakened kingside pawn structure and preparing to pierce through the enemy's defenses. Challenging the knight's advanced post, Black aims to disrupt white's active pieces and create space for their own rook on the open file. Securing the bishop on c7 creates a potent pin against the knight, simultaneously restricting its mobility and preparing to exploit the vulnerable pawn structure on the queen side. Seeking shelter for the rook and a slight regrouping of forces, though the initiative now squarely rests with the opponent's rook perched so aggressively on c7. Unleashing a tactical surprise, this knight check disrupts black's defensive structure and forces a decision, potentially opening lines for white's remaining pieces or forcing the black king into a more exposed position. The king bravely steps into a central confrontation, a daring maneuver to seek shelter and potentially disrupt white's advancing pawns. Opening up the file for rook activity is a bold assertion, aiming to penetrate black's position while simultaneously creating defensive pressure on the now exposed c5 bishop. Safeguarding the bishop from that discovered attack by the rook, and knight creates a necessary defensive posture, although it does surrender the initiative and allows white to solidify their central control with the rook now eyeing the open file.